Or record now, that works too. Okay, so official intro to podcast number 2. I am Dustin here with
Phoebe
and Rebecca.
So Phoebe and I are both on staff at Christian Student Fellowship, and so Rebecca had a question for us as a possible discussion question for something to consider on a podcast. So, would you like to introduce your question for the audience members? Members.
Yes. So I have a lot of people that come to me and they ask, how are these so-called Christians at college living the typical college life of out being partying, drinking, doing those extracurricular activities that don't exactly embody the Christian way of life. So what is the Christian way of life at college?
Gotcha. So we actually are pulling a twist on you a little bit, kind of. Because we're probably going to turn this into a 2-part podcast. So next week we're going to do a little bit of how do we interact with other believers. But this week, actually, we're going to take a look a little bit at what the Bible says in terms of what is our condition personally, to kind of know where we stand. Because one of the things when it comes to our interactions with other believers is that if we don't approach it in the right manner or the right light or the right heart or the right understanding, sometimes we can, it can end up becoming something that the person feels judged. Even if we don't mean it, if there's something a little bit, people can kind of sense, there's something a little bit off in the way that like they're kind of talking to me or they consider me. And it can kind of like shut people down spiritually to fellowshipping with you. And so, what our goal today is to kind of touch on what is kind of the condition of every believer, such that we can kind of see like what's the Lord's heart for us and what's the Lord's heart for other individuals. And then from there, we can kind of launch into, hopefully next week, how do we handle that interaction with other believers? How can we help other people? So anyway, any thoughts, Phoebe?
I think that's good. It's almost like instead of addressing the question straight on, we're kind of doing a background of what does this mean to us? Like, what does it mean for us to walk the Christian walk? And in return, like when we can understand what it means for us personally, then that affects how we view others also, and how we interact with others.
Yeah, so one of the things that we have to be careful with, and one of the things I think is part of just the Christian life and in the development of the Christian life, especially as we go on with the Lord, is it's almost like the Lord allows us to see a little bit more of ourselves. So oftentimes we approach our perception of other believers based on a kind of a false idea of who we are. We think that we're a certain way, and then the Lord, through various circumstances, allows us to see, okay, I'm not who I thought I was. Certain circumstances will come up, and we'll realize, hey, I didn't think I was going to make a mistake here. And the other thing too is, this is a pattern that's in the rest of the Bible, is that different individuals had different things that they struggled with. So that's another thing that we need to understand in terms of patterns is, maybe you can do and just as an example, there are things that can be sinful in our relationship with the Lord that aren't necessarily strictly in the 10 Commandments, but just using the 10 Commandments as something that's kind of simple reference. If you can keep all 9, you can keep 9 of the 10 Commandments, but you have one that you cannot keep, then in God's perception, he doesn't think that you're 90% good. He thinks you're 100% bad. If you mess up any one of the 10, and so the verse for that, and we mentioned it maybe a couple weeks ago, is James 2:10, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. And so this is the perception of kind of what happens in a sinful condition. So we have to acknowledge, and I think if we're being honest with ourselves, usually there's like one thing that we have trouble with. There's at least one thing that we have trouble with. Even Paul said that, and this is Romans 7, which we will be getting into next week. So plug for next week's Solid Ground. But in Romans 7, he talks about how actually he had trouble with coveting. He could do everything else. He had no problem doing everything else. By his perception at the moment, no problem doing everything else, but he had trouble coveting. Now, maybe there's some other person who has no problem coveting. Maybe someone goes through all the whole list and they're like, yeah, I have no problem coveting, but sometimes I lie. And I gotta break that habit, but it's a struggle for me. So I think, the first thing that we have to understand is each of us have different dispositions. We have different things that we struggle with. I think if anyone's being honest with themselves, no one's going to say that they're perfect, that they never struggle with anything. So when it comes to understanding first what's going on with other people, we need to be kind of open to understanding, like, hey, maybe something that I don't have problems with, or maybe something that's easy for me, maybe is not easy for someone else.
So are we saying then that the Christian walk or the Christian life isn't just a one-size-fits-all? It's not a standard procedure or protocol of which if we meet these requirements, we do these checklists, like we fit this box, then we're a good Christian. Is that what we're saying, essentially?
Yeah, it is one size fits all because Christ fits it all. But anyway, that's another. But no, you're right. I mean, not everyone equally has the same struggles. And oftentimes, and this is where it gets interesting too, oftentimes you may find a believer who's struggling, who's confronting their own difficulties, but they're genuine about those struggles. And sometimes that can be a mercy, because if you don't know that you have a problem, then the Lord can never change you. The Lord can never operate in you to make any kind of a difference. So anyway, yeah, like you said, it's not like a one size fit all Christian life. You have any thoughts, Rebecca? Any considerations? Any questions?
So I think one of my biggest questions regarding living like a Christian at college is how, when I mess up personally, because I'm by no means perfect in any way, shape, or form, how am I messing up affecting those around me? Because I want people to look at me and see Christ, that I'm a beacon of light for him here at college. But there are going to be those times that I mess up. So I want to know how it's going to sometimes affect somebody, and how maybe that may affect my witness to people.
Good question.
Yeah, there's two sides of that question, because a lot of the struggles that we have in our Christian life, many of them may be unseen. They're kind of between us and the Lord, in which case, if they're between us and the Lord and there are things that aren't obvious to other people, which I think is a lot of the struggles that we go through on a daily basis, they're not really open. They're just between us and the Lord.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things don't really hinder your testimony. They can hinder your experience of the Lord, but they don't really hinder your testimony. Whereas the things that we kind of do openly, whether it's because we feel okay about it, or even we promote certain activities, those are definitely things that can hinder our testimony.
Yeah.
You have anything?
Yeah. So, okay, today I was talking to some at the lunch table, and we were just they were helping me muse over this topic a little bit. And there was a situation in which one person brought up that they had apologized to another. And when they were talking about it, it was like, well, what did you apologize for? It didn't seem like a big deal, and it didn't seem like, worthy of needing to be a thing to apologize for. But I was, I don't know, it struck me that this matter, well, kind of what Dustin was touching on about something hidden and something outward, that it was a matter of like their conscience, like for this person, this interaction, what they said, it affected their conscience, and the Lord touched them on that of, oh, that wasn't a proper, you shouldn't have said that. So it wasn't even like it wasn't bad enough to warrant a apology. It was the matter that the Lord touched them on this thing, and for this person it was necessary, but maybe for somebody else the Lord would touch them on something else. And so like that was a outward thing. That wasn't something, well, it was from the Lord personally, the relationship with the Lord, and then coming forth into the testimony and the witnessing for him.
Yeah, so I'm glad you touched the matter of conscience, because one of the verses that I had to discuss is, it's actually 1 Timothy 1:19. And so this is Paul writing to Timothy, and he says, holding faith in a good conscience. By rejecting this, some have become shipwrecked of their faith, or shipwrecked in the faith, depending on how you want to translate it. And so basically what Paul is saying is, a way that you can lose your faith is by not regarding your conscience. So if you shut off your conscience and you're not listening to what God is saying to you, actually you can lose your faith. You can stop having the same kind of strength in your belief in God. But kind of like along those lines, Phoebe, like what you're saying is, different believers are at different stages. Someone who's been with the Lord for 60 years has a different development in their relationship with the Lord and what is being shined on in their daily life. So, God may have a much more strict dealing with someone who's had 60 years being with the Lord than someone who was just saved, the other day.
Yeah.
And so, there are some things where maybe someone does something and it bothers us, but that's not something that the Lord is shining on in them. Maybe not right now. Maybe the Lord is dealing with something else. So that's another thing we have to consider is, someone, this is basically treat your neighbor as you would, love your neighbor like you would love yourself. Or, it's along the lines of like, you probably have something that you do that bothers someone else. And they're saying, how can they do this kind of a thing? Well, if God isn't shining, he's not illuminating that matter in your conscience to deal with. If he's not illuminating that in their conscience to deal with, then you should probably kind of come before the Lord to consider, how do I handle this? Lord, what are you doing in this person? And I think a lot of things come down to prayer. Prayer for not just us, but even for other people. Granted, there's more things that come into our interactions with others that we can probably get into. But the other side of this too, just one thing that I kind of like to, that always kind of comes up when I consider this matter of particularly the conscience, is your conscience can be calibrated to things that are not necessarily the Spirit. Your conscience can be calibrated to things that are actually your culture. This is one of the things I think is like one of the joys, one of the wonderful things of living in the southern U.S. is it is the Bible Belt. We do get exposed to God's word. We do get, we get to hear, the word spoken in a lot of locations where people don't have that experience. But that being said, without the Spirit's kind of shining and leading in terms of how we handle ourselves and handle our affairs with one another, we can develop a kind of Christian culture that isn't necessarily the Spirit. And so we may see someone doing something and our Christian culture says, I don't like that. I don't like the way they're carrying themselves or what they're doing. And we really have to be careful to check, Lord, is this how you feel about this? Or is this just because this is my culture? This is what I'm used to doing. And like a simple, it's a silly example, but, maybe you grew up in with a group of believers who are very quiet. They're very reserved. And then you find another believer who when they sing to the Lord, they like to dance a little bit. You know what I mean? it's funny, but maybe they like to dance a little bit.
Right.
Well, if you're coming from that very quiet, very very reserved group of believers, you might see that person and be like, oh, how could they do that? How could they? They're just dancing out here, just singing and dancing for the Lord, Well, that is really more along the lines of your culture, the Christian culture that you're kind of associated with. That's not really something that's and it's not really something that's against maybe God's word or what the Spirit is doing. Granted, the place that this everything gets really complicated is the Lord and the Spirit are a finer example of what we should or should not do than merely the letters of the law. And so, Rebecca, kind of like along the lines of what you're asking, something that may be a stumbling block to another believer. So maybe that person who's dancing, not necessarily sinful, but maybe it's a stumbling block to that person who's reserved. You know that it's going to be a stumbling block to that person who's reserved, but you do it anyway because it's maybe your culture to dance. And so maybe that's where the Spirit comes in and says, hey, maybe don't dance with this person who's reserved because you don't want to hinder the fellowship that you have with this person. So,
Yeah.
So that's where, it goes both ways. On the one hand, we have to make sure that what we're being bothered by is really coming from the Lord. It's not just our Christian culture. It's coming from a genuine, like kind of an understanding of the word. What does the word say about these different matters? But we also have to be sensitive to what is the Spirit doing in that moment regarding our interactions with one another.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting how God is just outside of a definite box in our experience, in our living. You have those passages in the Gospels where it talks about, like, you see the splinter in your brother's eye, but then you miss the beam in your own eye. Like, we see these flaws in others. But then you also have Paul talking about describing the believers as a body. And, does the eye say to the ear, like, I have no need of you? Like, we all need one another in different ways. But then also, he talks about how, like, there's some who don't eat who don't eat meat, not because the meat in of themselves is bad, but then, like, for the sake of those who are bothered by it, he would, like, rather not eat what bothers them. There's references for these things after. But basically, it's just like the God is so broad in some things and so inclusive in what is non-essential, not essential to our faith, not essential to, I think we've talked in previous podcasts about the common faith and the things that really make us Christians. And then the side things, these things help us in our Christian walk a little bit, touching on what Rebecca shared earlier about, like the extracurricular activities that happen in college. Do these things affect our faith? They don't make us Christians or take us away as being Christians, but they can affect our walk with the Lord. And I think that's kind of the heart of what we're talking about today, is that it's not so much that our faith is based upon whether or not we do these things, but it's a matter of these can hinder both our testimony of the Lord and also our fellowship with the Lord. If we're not sensitive to how the Spirit is leading us inwardly, then these things can keep us, in a sense, from going and growing in our faith.
Yeah, and I think the other major thing to consider too is how does anyone change, really? How do we change personally, and how do maybe someone that we're concerned for change in the way that they behave, or the way that they maybe they are blatantly doing something that is that they're a believer, they are doing something that's blatantly contrary to to the word and what you know is clear concerning what is righteous and what is not.
Yeah.
Not getting into how do we interact with him, but more at the end of the day, how do they change and how do you change fundamentally? Even if you see something in yourself, how do you change? Well, if you try to just do a change of behavior, if you just make it like a habit, like I just am choosing to not do this, and this is again a plug for next week, Romans 7. Basically Romans 7.
Yeah.
If you try to do it, you're going to fail every time. You may hold off for a while. you might be able to, depending on how strong your willpower is, and different people have different strengths of willpower. You might be able to go a long time and not do this thing, but you'll find one day, boom, it happens again, and you didn't even realize that you had done it.
Yeah.
And so ultimately what really changes us is the life of Christ that's within us. Watering that life, feeding that life, allowing that life to spread into the rest of our being, take over those things. Because ultimately that's where transformation comes into place. If you just will yourself, you're not going to get very far in your Christian life if every time you find a problem with yourself, you just will yourself to force yourself to do better. But the thing that's amazing about, the way that the Lord has arranged in his word is if you find that if you're reading, you have a habit to read the Bible every day, you have a habit of praying and having fellowship with the Lord, if you have a habit of being in fellowship with other believers, just seeking it out, even if it's, even if you don't want it, just seeking out like, hey, I'm having a rough time, I'm dealing with this stuff, but I would still like to, have an opportunity to just pray and fellowship together, even if it's little things, then that's a watering, that's a feeding in spirit, in you, that's allowing the Spirit to expand in you. It's allowing the Spirit to gain the different parts of your heart. And you'll find gradually that you don't care about those things anymore. You'll gradually find, I don't want to do those things. And it's not because you're willing yourself to do it. It's just because the Spirit's moving into those parts of your being. So, on the one hand, we can look at what are the legal requirements? What does it mean to sin? What does it mean to, mess up your testimony? That's one side of things. But at the end of the day, the only way that we really meet the standard or transform or change is really by the gradual increase of the life of Christ spreading into our being, gaining the parts of our heart that love all these different things, that want to pursue these different things. And even, the part that we, when we come to realize like, hey, my experience of the Lord is better than doing these things. When I do these things, I get a certain experience, but you know what? When I enjoy the Lord, I enjoy the Lord more than these things. But that takes time, and that takes prayer. That takes, again, being in the Word, growing in the Lord, allowing the Lord to gain those parts of your heart.
Yeah. I know we're probably short on time, but real quick, I heard somewhere someone said, religion wants to change us from the outside in, but God changes us from the inside out. And with that, I think it's even in the outward things that we see, kind of the differences in us and others that we notice that might bother us. It's almost like God's mercy and using these things to show us, oh, this bothers you. Like, why does this bother you? How can we grow with him in these little things, in these little rubbings that we might have with each other? We're like, well, we're both Christians, but why do I feel this way about them? Or why do I have these thoughts? And it's almost, like a blessing that he can use these outward things to bring us back to the inward, like what he's doing inside of us, inside our heart.
I also think, Phoebe, what you said can go back to the Christian culture you were raised in, because personally, I was raised, you don't go out partying Saturday night, then show up to church Sunday morning kind of thing. But I have some really good friends who were raised like that it was okay to go out Saturday or Friday and Saturday night partying, having a great time. As long as you were in church on Sunday morning, you were fine. You were still keeping your faith. Personally, it's not how I was raised, but I do think that goes back to what you were saying, Phoebe, of the Christian culture that we all live in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and even those things come down to maybe they're not ideal for your relationship with the Lord, but maybe that's just not what the Lord's touching right now, you know? Because those same friends may, a few years down the road, the Lord may touch them and say, hey, it'd be great is if you were well rested and ready to enjoy me in the morning tomorrow. And he touches them in love, he draws them in love. One of my favorite experiences at the end of John, where Jesus is talking to Peter and he asks him, do you love me? And I feel like a lot of times this is how the Lord transforms us. He doesn't transform us by condemning us. He transforms us and exposes us by asking, do you love me? So, for some of them, their interaction with the Lord may end up being, so he may not be bothered by them doing that, but maybe he wants something better. And so the way he'll gain them is he'll say, hey, do you love me? So-and-so, do you love me? What about going to bed, having a time with me the night before so that you're ready in the morning to enjoy me?
Mm-hmm.
In which case, that's like a major recovery right there. That's like the best way, You could tell someone a million times, hey, this is maybe not the best way to go about it. They'll probably never listen. But for the Lord to come in their relationship with him and say, do you love me?
Yeah.
Well, have some time of prayer, the night before. Maybe that's the way to go about it. But those are things where those are hidden interactions that we have with the Lord, and we really don't know what is happening with those individuals. So kind of again, it goes back a little bit to prayer. It's like, I remember someone shared one time, one of the best things that you can pray for is that you could pray that someone would pray for you.
Hmm.
Because that's where the Lord operates in our prayers to help one another.
Yeah.
And maybe the Lord exposes you in your prayer. You start praying for something and the Lord's like, that's not what I'm praying for. So
Yeah. Good. Well, that's
I'll
just a
just share
start.
maybe one last verse and we
Okay.
can conclude. One of my favorite examples, and this is just another one to give us an idea of kind of how we should handle maybe our consideration of one another, is actually most of John 13. It's the beginning of John 13, and it's the example where Jesus is having dinner with them, and he basically girds himself, and he gets down and he starts washing the feet of the disciples.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the perfect man who has every right to condemn the sin that exists in these disciples. He has every right to expose, quote, the dirt on their feet.
Mm-hmm.
But his heart was, I'm going to get down on the ground and I'm going to wash your feet. I'm going to wash the earth off of you. And he said, this you should do to one another. I do this as an example for you. And that's what he says in verse 15. I have given you an example that you also should do as I have done. And so anyway, that should be kind of the feeling that we have, especially, considering going into next week, regarding one another, is like, at the end of the day, I love you. I want to wash your feet.
Mm. Amen.
So any concluding thoughts?
Oh.
Well then, thank you guys for joining us. Podcast number 2.
See you next time.
Goodbye.